Now the question before macroeconomists is what to possibly do about this recessionary gap, about the fact that unemployment rates are higher, the level of real output is low. Are there any policy tools, are there any measures that could help mitigate these problems, that could help bring people back to work, that could help bring the level of real output back closer to what the economy is capable of? Well, in actual fact, economists are in disagreement about this issue. We're going to explore the schools of thought of two different groups. The classical economists, who propose that there should be a hands-off approach and allow the market to regulate itself, versus the Keynesians, who favor a more policy-oriented, active, hands-on approach. Let's start with the classical economists. The classical economists assume that markets tend to move towards their equilibrium on their own. They cite this because that wages and prices and interest rates all tend to be flexible over time. And as flexible prices and flexible wages do move towards their equilibrium levels, this helps bring markets back towards their long-run status. Back to the story of Econoland, recall that since unemployment rates are higher than the natural rate, that this leads to a situation with a big surplus of workers. The classical economists would argue here that because wages are generally flexible, they would fall and go down to meet the underlying economic conditions. As these wages are falling, firms would hire workers again and put people back to work. Interest rates and rental rates would fall. Firms consequently would also bring those factories back and those other factors into production. The economy then has kind of moved out of its recession back towards what it's capable of without any policy intervention. We can show this scenario and we could tell this story using our aggregate demand and aggregate supply graph. Since we're in a recessionary gap with higher unemployment rates, there is pressure for nominal wages to fall. As nominal wages fall, and as workers are moving their expected future wages and expected future prices downward, this leads them back to work. This is shown with a movement of the short-run aggregate supply curve to the right. As wages are falling, the short-run aggregate supply shifts to the right. Firms employ those workers and those factories, and the economy moves back towards its full employment level of output, back to RY1. So in summary, the fundamental premise of the classical economists is that flexible prices and flexible wages help move markets towards their equilibrium levels on their own, and that they can self-regulate. And over time, the business cycle is going to mitigate itself. On the other hand, the Keynesian school of thought would argue against the positions of the classical economists. Instead of flexible prices and flexible wages, Keynesians would argue that the economy is inherently unstable and that there are forces that prevent prices from adjusting, that prevent wages from adjusting. These rigidities in the system prevent these things from occurring. Keynesians cite a few reasons for this. First, they would point out to the fact that many workers are on contract, and over a period of a contract, that wage is sort of stuck. It is fixed at a certain level. And if there is downward pressure on price levels, this is leaving real wages to rise, and firms are cutting back on production. This is one point, or this is one way that these wages are sort of frozen. Another reason that Keynesians might cite is that there are morale problems from adjusting nominal wages even downward, and that firms and workers are reluctant to kind of move towards that path. This is also one of the reasons that many firms pay what are called efficiency wages, which are level of wages that are higher than their market rates. In summary, Keynesians are going to say that these rigidities to prices and wages prevent markets from adjusting on their own, at least over a long period of time. Furthermore, they might also stress that because workers are out of work, that they're going to continue to spend less and that they will save more. And as this happens, firms will further lay off more workers and produce less, which then leaves more people out of work and more people spend less and save more. So unemployment rates in this scenario can remain persistently high. This is why Keynesians are going to argue for a more active policy and active government response. Their first best option would be to utilize that one spending component of aggregate demand that does not depend on thousands of individuals making decisions, but rather on the government, which through a few legislative moves and signature by the president can put into action big spending measures that could help bring people back to work. If the government has big outlays, they would be bringing on companies and firms who would then be hiring workers. The government could instead also hire workers directly themselves. All of these things, they are producing more as unemployment rates are falling. As a second best option, Keynesians would also stress that they could cut taxes. And in cutting of taxes, this leads consumers and firms with more discretionary incomes. With this discretionary income and retained earnings, they could spend more. Businesses and consumers spend more. We can show this story using our aggregate demand and aggregate supply graph. Since the economy is in a recessionary gap, the government could step in either through an increase in government spending or a decrease in taxes, both of which lead to an increase in the budget deficit. Because government spending is a direct component of aggregate demand, and a tax cut could indirectly stimulate and spur spending in aggregate demand, the aggregate demand curve would shift back to the right. As it does so, output increases, price levels rise as the economy moves back towards the full employment level of output, back to its long-run capacity. If neither of these policy measures are possible given the workings of the government, Keynesian would also argue that any use of policy tools and policy measures can be beneficial to the overall economy. As such, they would hope that the central bank would utilize expansionary monetary policy to help bring the economy back towards full employment as well. To see how this mechanism would work, recall that the central bank could increase the money supply, which then leads banks to have more reserves in their system. And if banks lend these reserves, consumers and businesses can borrow and spend. And as they do so, aggregate demand could shift back to the right. Showing this scenario on our graph, as the central bank increases the money supply, this leads more reserves in the system, which leads to more borrowing and spending by businesses through investment spending and consumers through consumption spending. This process could lead the aggregate demand curve to shift back to the right, with output levels that are closer to the full employment rate and now with higher price levels. Through this mechanism, the economy can also move towards its long-run capacity through a policy mechanism. In summary, macroeconomists do disagree about the process by which the business cycle can be mitigated. On the one hand, the classical economists say that the economy can self-regulate and that with flexible prices and flexible wages, this allows the unemployment rates to come down on their own and bring people back to work. On the other hand, Keynesians would stress that this doesn't happen, that these market adjustments won't occur on their own, and rather it takes kind of that first nudge of the government or the first nudge of the central bank to be the spur that brings the economy back towards full employment. Classical economists might respond that saying that using government spending or taxes is really a misallocation of resources that firms and individuals would spend differently on their own. Moreover, that using the central bank and the money supply is only going to lead to inflation in the long run. Unfortunately, we will not settle this issue here. However, nicely using our story and the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model, we can show these competing schools of thought on our favored diagram.